Helen, good evening, everyone. In the next few minutes, we'd like to tell you about a revolution that started right here in mechanical engineering. It was actually inspired by our German medical collaborators who called up in March 2020, in the middle of lockdown, and said, can you help us actually quantify the damage that COVID is doing to our bodies? And what we did is come up with a whole new X-ray technique that lets you see inside yourself, that inner universe, not just the outer universe, like we've never seen before. Well, X-rays aren't new. The first X-ray image was in 1895 by Roentgen. Over the previous 100 years, it's continuously got better. Higher resolution. Recently, everything's digital. And in 1972, Hounsfield in the UK developed the first computed tomography, making it 3D as well. However, the resolution of clinical CT scanners is about 1 millimeter. That's a tenth of my finger. So if we look at those fingers there, they're only just resolved. COVID can do damage at many scales, including very small. So we went through and came up with a technique, which we co-developed with ESRF, and let's fly out to the European synchrotron and see just how it works. We're going to fly to the French Alps, so let's journey off to the French Alps and see something that's bigger than Wembley. ESRF takes electrons and accelerates them up under electric field to the speed of light, or nearly the speed of light. They're moving relativistically, aging 20% slower than us. Wouldn't it be lovely? And when we bend them, because the only thing they want to do is go straight, we bend them and they shed synchrotron radiation. That's light from energies of wavelengths of near-infrared up to hard X-rays. And ESRF, they just finished, just before lockdown in France, an upgrade of 100 million euros to make it the highest energy, most coherent X-ray laser source in the world. Using this together with Paul Taffero, who's on the screen behind me, virtually appearing, we developed this new technique called Hierarchical Phase-Contrast Tomography. I'm not going to go through and explain it, but I'll show you the results. This is a human brain with X-rays, and it's showing not just hard matter, but soft matter. We're resolving down to 1 micron locally. That's 1,000 times higher resolution than the current medical CTs. Since that's in 3 dimensions, that's 1,000 cubed or 1 billion times more information, resolving the microvasculature as shown here and many other features in the brain. Well, let's get back to COVID. Why does it impact on COVID? Well, I'm going to hand you over to Claire Walsh, who will tell you just that.
Thank you very much, Peter. Back in the nick of time. So let's first have a little look at the human lung. This is the structure of the human lung. Its function is to exchange oxygen with the blood, and it's got structure over a number of different length scales in order to do that. Starting on the left-hand side with the big air pipe, the trachea, this branches into smaller and smaller tubes until you get down to the level of the alveoli. These are a bunch of grape-like structures, and they have a very thin wall which allows oxygen to diffuse into the surrounding blood vessels. Now, this structure is really important for the function of the lung, but COVID can also damage any of these structures. And what's really important for us to be able to understand and treat it is that we understand not only how this damage is distributed in the whole lung, but also how each of these structures might be affected by that disease. So this is a CT, a clinical CT of a human lung with COVID-19. The black areas are open air spaces, and the white areas are fluid, tissue, and damaged parts of the lung. So with the clinical CT, we can see how that damage is uneven throughout the lung. But if we wanted to look at really high detail, so look at the alveoli, for instance, of the lung, we wouldn't be able to do that with a clinical CT. All we'd see is a gray cube. It just doesn't have the power to resolve. With HiP CT, however, as Peter previously showed, this is an example of HiP CT. Again, the black areas are the open air spaces, the gray is the tissue, the blood, the fluid. And what we're able to see is that Not only can we see the overall picture of how that damage is distributed within the lung, but we can actually see down to the very fine detail. So if I'm going to go over and show you and my colleagues here, this is a small part of a healthy bit of lung, and you can see quite how open the pores within that are. This is looking at the scale of the alveoli, and we can see how well that could exchange oxygen with the blood. If I go over to my colleague Sharuk here, he's holding a small part of the lung that we imaged with HiP-CT, and it's the yellow part that you can see up there. Now, this part of the lung has been damaged by COVID, but it's still sort of functional. You can see there's some open air spaces in here that could exchange oxygen with the blood. Finally, if I go across to my colleague Alicia, she sadly has the blue area of that lung up there. This is an incredibly damaged part. There's almost no open air spaces left at all. There's a few larger kind of ducts here, but these don't exchange oxygen with the blood, and these would be completely non-functioning. Now, if we had a clinical CT scanner, and we had both of these two areas, these are about the same size as a single pixel on a CT scan would be, it would be very difficult to tell these two areas of damage apart. But in order to understand something like COVID-19, what we want to do is exactly that, understand what this structure looks like. Now, before HiP-CT came along, if we wanted to look at these structures, we could physically cut a small piece out of the lung, so we call this a biopsy, and you could look at it under a microscope to understand what was going on. But there are some problems with doing this, and I'm going to hand over to Hannah to explain those problems.
Thank you, Claire. Audience participation, fantastic. You're already well warmed up. Okay, so as Claire said, I'm going to try and explain some of the difficulties that we face when we sort of image at these length scales. So let's imagine that this theatre represents that damaged area of that COVID lung that we saw from the clinical CT scan earlier, and we want to investigate it further. So everyone whose name begins with Z, can you put your hand up? Oh, yeah, we've got some people. Okay, great. Right. You represent, thank you for the lights, you can drop them now. You represent our heavily damaged COVID lung areas, sorry. Now, now, if I'm going to take a biopsy, I know that this is the area that I'm mainly interested in. However, I can't biopsy the whole area. If I take a section here where nobody put their hands up, I might then look at that under the microscope, and it's going to look like a slightly healthier area or a very healthy area, and it's very misleading because we're not getting the full picture. So how do we overcome this? Well, HiP-CT can overcome this, which is what we've just spoken about. However, one of the obstacles is that the X-ray dosage required to image at HiP-CT is fatal to humans. So at the moment, it gets better, it gets better. So at the moment, we are imaging whole organs of people who have died and donated their bodies to science. Now, this information is still incredibly useful, as Claire has demonstrated. But what we're trying to do now is to use this information that we've got from these organs and link them to the clinical images that we image daily in hospitals. And we're trying to take advantage of machine learning techniques, AI, so that we can sort of withdraw or pull out that information that we know is hidden in those clinical images that looks like that grey cube that Claire hinted at earlier, and transform them into the images that we get from HiP-CT. And this is something that could really revolutionize the way we understand clinical imaging. Thank you.